You have a PowerPoint. Can you guys see me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hear you and we see your presentation.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Moore, Vice Chair Brown, task force members, and a happy one-year-old birthday to my youngest baby girl, Zuri. Today, I want to briefly go over me and my team's involvement in helping shape the AB 3121 legislation that is responsible for the task force you occupy today, and also reemphasize the importance of a lineage standard and its place in the legislation through the process. I want to recognize my sister, Tiffany Quarles, because it was she who sent out the call to action in March 2019 to organize politically. It was then many of us decided to get off the internet and get active in the political process, play a part in influencing our own destiny. Next slide. We had a few meetings and conducted our first town hall to educate the community on the need for lineage-specific reparations. After the town hall, we formed our first board of what is now known today as NAASDLA. From there, our organizing extended across the state, forming associations with groups from Northern California to San Diego, a coalition that is now known as CJEC. Next slide. Our first order of business was becoming aware of AJR 21, a resolution by Assemblywoman Dr. Shirley Weber that required California to apologize for its complicity in enabling and furthering the practice of slavery. Next slide. Shortly after came ACR 130, again by Dr. Weber, that recognized the need to pursue the avenues of reparations. Next slide. AB 3121 was introduced into the CA legislature in February 2020. We secured a meeting with Dr. Weber a month later in March. I need everyone to understand we do this for real, so in studying reparations legislation, we realize, next slide, AB 3121 in its original form was a rewrite of HR 40, originally HR 3745 with California specifics added to it. Next slide. HR 40 was a reimagining of S 1647, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians Act, also known as Redress for Japanese Americans. Next slide. AB 3121 contained the same language as HR 40 that identified the eligible party as simply African American. This made sense for the Honorable John Conyers to frame this bill this way in 1989 because, next slide, as a 2015 Pew Research study shows, the percentage of the U.S. black population that was foreign-born in 1980 was 3.1%. and had only risen to 4.9% in 1990. So the title African American referred to a specific type of person at the time with a specific lineage. Because of this, we thought we were going into the Dr. Weber meeting to make a case for make our case and explain to her the importance of lineage specificity. We did, but it was really unnecessary because Dr. Weber was already there. And recently in the January task force meeting, now Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber shared her passion for the need of not just reparations, but lineage-specific reparations. We began meeting on a weekly basis directly after our initial meeting to identify areas where we felt we could improve the legislation. Dr. Weber's office agreed to review our amendments in the May meeting. The problem was this meeting was midday on a Tuesday, and the next committee in the legislature was reviewing the bill that Thursday morning, so we had less than 48 hours to not only submit the amendments, but submit them in a way that would pass Legislative Council because we didn't have the time needed to do revisions if necessary. Next slide. I want to pause here and get everyone to understand we aren't politicians or professional political staffers. We are regular people who decide to come outside and get active in real life, not the internet. We don't get paid in any way. We spend our own money to get things done. So in reality, for the last 3 years, we all have been operating at a net negative financially when it comes to this cause. We do this because we all believe in the justice of reparations. The philosopher Army Osei Frimpong asked a question I stand by. Would you rather have a few wealthy black folks or a stable middle-class black community? Being a product of Inglewood and South Central LA in the late 80s and 90s, I'm blessed to survive the times, and it's because of this I will put everything in my being to seeing the stable black community across the nation, and that is facilitated by reparations. Back to the legislation. We had a time crunch, no margin of error, and no expertise in the field to ensure this would get done. Next slide. By this time, after meeting weekly, we had crafted 9 amendments, but we needed guidance to make sure we got this right. So my wife tapped into a former colleague who was a lobbyist and was familiar with generally how legislation should be crafted. Originally, our language read American descendants of slavery, but it was quickly realized that term had zero legal precedent and would be thrown out immediately. He insisted African American had to be part of the language, but unlike in 1989, this term is now used as an umbrella term for anyone who is Black with American citizenship. So we worked through terms to make it more specific to the proper community of eligibility. It was here we came up with African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. Again, I am just a citizen, but understanding the urgency of the moment, I researched how to properly edit a bill, striking old language, adding new, etc., and went through AB 3121, adding in our 9 amendments where they made the most sense. My brother Chris Lotson took what I had done afterwards and put the finishing touches on it, but we wanted to make sure. So I reached out to a friend from college who's in the political sphere, and she connected us with a legislative/policy consultant. The consultant agreed that American descendants of slavery had no precedent and would not work, and gave us notes related to our other amendments. We made the necessary changes and submitted our amended version of AB 3121 to Dr. Weber's office. Everything I just stated happened over the course of about 12 hours. That Thursday morning, Dr. Weber's office told us they would keep 2 of our amendments. Next slide. And that is the identified eligible party, African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, as well as Article 6, Section 8301.5, that reads any state level reparations actions that are undertaken as a result of this chapter are not a replacement for any reparations enacted at the federal level and shall not be interpreted as such. Of course, we were ecstatic because we've been working hard for this, but we also understood this was just the beginning. Chris Lotson and I were later tapped by Dr. Weber's office to provide expert testimony for one of AB 3121's hearings. Everybody who knows me knows well I don't need the spotlight, and there's no problem for me to do what's necessary for the greater good. I took a step back to allow my brother of almost 2 decades, Dr. Kenjis Watson, to take my place and give testimony, and Chris graciously gave up his spot to another individual who we thought could provide the best testimony at the time. I have to reiterate that the greater good trumps my feelings and my ego. It's about the end goal, period. Next slide. In August, the bill was amended, adding with special consideration language to the community of eligibility. After lots of scrambling and many conversations, we learned from Dr. Weber directly that she made the change herself to ensure the descendants of free Blacks were not excluded. We remained in the process even after passing the legislature. Tiffany Quarles tapped Congresswoman Maxine Waters and Ice Cube to put pressure on Governor Newsom to sign the legislation because he waited until the very last day. Next slide. I also have to recognize Tiffany for leaning on the governor's office to do a public signing ceremony for this historic action that many of us attended. Next slide. In closing, I want to reiterate that the standard is a lineage standard, and this is a message directly to my Pan-African brothers and sisters. The world at large has committed atrocities against us through time, but that does not take away our responsibility, the responsibility I owe to myself, my people, and my ancestors to do things the right way. It would be an injustice on my part to let my feelings get in the way of what is just, what is logical, and what is legal. Historical precedent, whether it was Japanese redress or Holocaust reparations, all have the same thing in common. A narrow scope of community of eligibility was identified in initial legislation. As clarified on pages 274 and 406 of Pablo de Grief's Handbook of Reparations, adjacent groups, whether it was Japanese Peruvians who were interned by the U.S. or people of Jewish descent who suffered outside of Germany during the Holocaust, found success with subsequent legislation and legal action. Dean of Berkeley Law, Erwin Chemerinsky, the foremost constitutional scholar, possibly in the world, testified before this body and indicated the standard should be a lineage standard because a race standard will violate Proposition 209 and the 14th Amendment. Feelings are not facts. But the fact is, your feelings of trying to reshape this into a race standard will ensure that the history books record your names as the people who selfishly orchestrated the failure of reparations for the African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States because they chose their feelings and ideology over what was legal, logical, and just. Next slide. My father was from Tyler, Texas. My mother is from New Smyrna Beach, Florida. In a single afternoon during a FamilySearch.org workshop at their Los Angeles location, I was able to trace 2 strands of my family back to the 1840s, including a great-great-great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. I'm just about done. I categorically reject the disrespect an insult conveyed by groups like Narcan and Cobra, who routinely reduce the bedrock people and backbone of the United States, the African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, as nothing more than a small group. You are a disappointment and disrespectful to your ancestors, but it's cool. We are here to step in and complete the mission. This body is not the place to solve racism in America. This body is tasked with delivering reparations in California. Make the eligibility standard a lineage standard today. Thank you.